Back in America's boldest car years, a few strange machines appeared that looked less like automobiles and more like visitors from another world. Built only once and never repeated, they flashed across the scene like UFOs and disappeared just as quickly. Here are the rare one-off cars that still feel almost unreal today. Back in 1941, just before the world changed forever, Chrysler unveiled a machine that looked less like an automobile and more like something a designer might sketch after dreaming about tomorrow. The Chrysler Thunderbolt didn't resemble anything rolling on American roads at the time. Most cars were boxy, upright, and decorated with chrome in straight lines. The Thunderbolt arrived like a smooth drop of liquid metal, its body rounded in long, flowing curves that made people stop mid-stride and stare. It was shown at world's fairs and special exhibitions, glowing under bright lights, and visitors approached it with the same caution and wonder they might give to a work of futuristic sculpture. People whispered that it looked like something flown in rather than driven in. What truly set it apart was its retractable metal roof. In 1941, the idea of a hard top that could disappear at the push of a button sounded like pure science fiction. You didn't see mechanisms like that outside aviation prototypes or industrial equipment. Yet here was Chrysler, presenting a touch-operated, electrically driven metal roof that folded itself away cleanly, leaving behind a spotless open cockpit. Spectators gathered around just to watch the transformation, hearing the faint electric hum as the panels moved. Older witnesses later recalled that the first time they saw the roof slide back, the crowd around them gasped out loud. Someone joked that if it started levitating next, they wouldn't be surprised. It was the sort of engineering stunt that made people believe anything might be possible in the world of tomorrow. Even the body construction was unusual. The entire car sat low and sleek, with fenders blended smoothly into the body instead of sticking out as separate shapes. The headlights were hidden. The belt line swooped gently from one end to the other. It had no sharp edges, no awkward angles, no visible hinges or seams. Every surface seemed carefully massaged into place by hand. The car looked polished even when it wasn't moving, almost as if air would rather slip around it than resist it. This was the era's idea of aerodynamic beauty, taken to its extreme. But the truth behind the Thunderbolt's grace was complexity. It wasn't a production line car. It wasn't even a prototype meant for mass adoption. Each one required careful, patient hand-building, with mechanics and craftsmen shaping the panels, adjusting the mechanism, and checking every detail by eye. The retractable roof alone demanded an enormous amount of precision. You couldn't rush it, and you couldn't scale it. As Chrysler quickly realized, what looked effortlessly modern on the show floor required hours and hours of meticulous labor behind the scenes. The cost per unit skyrocketed. Every time the car toured to a new city, curious engineers from smaller shops would ask Chrysler representatives, "Are you actually planning to sell this thing?" The official answer was usually a vague smile. In the end, Chrysler made only one Thunderbolt for practical purposes. A few similar cars were created for the traveling show, but the true concept never entered real production. It was simply too expensive, too delicate, and too ahead of its time to become anything but a spectacle. The world was also on the edge of war, and the appetite for extravagant experiments was fading fast. The Thunderbolt became a kind of frozen moment, a flash of optimism from the last peaceful year, preserved in photographs and memories rather than in showrooms.
Older car enthusiasts who saw it in person still talk about how quiet the crowd would get around it, as if everyone sensed they were looking at something not meant for everyday roads. One man later said that when the Thunderbolt rolled past him at the fair, it didn't feel like a car at all, more like a rolling promise of a future that never fully materialized. Today, the 1941 Chrysler Thunderbolt stands as one of those rare stories in American automotive history. A dream car built to dazzle, not to sell. A sculpture on wheels that showed what could happen when imagination was allowed to run ahead of practicality. It was too much, too soon, but beautiful in a way that still captures the imagination. A single brilliant spark from an era that believed the future was only one bold idea away.
In 1953, at a time when America was falling in love with speed, glamour, and the idea of the jet age, Harley Earl decided to create something that wasn't a car in the ordinary sense, it was a statement. The Buick Wildcat 1 emerged from GM's styling studios as a low, shimmering turquoise roadster that seemed built more for the pages of a glossy magazine than for any public street. Earl treated it like a personal sculpture, a rolling piece of art meant to show the world what American design could look like if every practical concern were pushed aside. People who saw it in person still remember the color first. That deep, watery turquoise didn't resemble the factory paints found on Buicks in dealerships. Under bright show lights, it had a richness that seemed to change tone as it moved, almost like looking into a gemstone. It wrapped around a long, low body with curves that flowed from nose to tail, giving the car a sense of motion even when it stood still. Visitors at the Motorama shows would approach it slowly, half expecting it to be fragile, like touching it might leave fingerprints on something sacred. The windshield was unlike anything people had seen, a full wraparound arc of glass, sweeping so far to the sides that it felt more like the canopy of a small aircraft. It made the car feel open, airy, unbounded. Sitting behind it, you didn't just look through the windshield, you looked out into the world like a pilot preparing for takeoff. Harley Earl loved that effect. He wanted people to feel like the future was right there, just past the glass. And then there were the small details, the ones Earl always obsessed over. Chrome pieces carved as if they were bits of jewelry, shaped not for necessity, but for beauty. Vent openings framed in delicate metal, trim lines that followed the car's curves like the strokes of a designer's pen. The interior was hand-fitted, cushioned in materials far more elegant than anything in production cars of the day. Standing inside the show pavilion, the Wildcat 1 looked less like a Buick and more like the kind of dream car magazines would sketch for readers imagining the year 1965. Under the hood, Buick placed its new Nailhead V8, still fresh and exciting, a sign that the company wasn't just dreaming about performance, it was preparing for it. The car wasn't built to run quarter-mile times or set records, but it could move, and that gave people a thrill. Observers said that even when the engine idled, the whole car seemed to purr with confidence. But everyone also understood the truth. The Wildcat 1 was never meant to be sold. GM created it for Motorama crowds, for photographers, for the idea of progress. The hand-shaped body panels, the custom-made interior, the one-off engineering pieces, none of it belonged on a normal assembly line. It would have taken weeks to build each car, and the price would have been absurd.
So, after the auto show season, after the crowds had finished marveling at it and the magazines had printed their excited headlines, the Wildcat 1 quietly disappeared. It didn't go to dealerships or drag strips or private owners who wanted to show it off around town. Instead, it slipped into private storage, the way a movie star might step through a side door to avoid the cameras once the premiere is over. The bright lights dimmed, the crowds moved on, and the Wildcat returned to the quiet. Yet, even in silence, it remained one of Harley Earl's proudest creations. Designers who worked under him later said that if you ever wanted to understand Earl's imagination, the sweeping lines, the love of color, the belief that cars should stir emotion before logic, you didn't look at a production Buick, you looked at the Wildcat 1. It was the distilled essence of his vision, unfiltered by accountants or engineers. Today, the car survives as one of the most beautiful dream machines of the 1950s, a reminder of a moment when American automakers weren't just building transportation, they were building fantasies. And none captured that spirit more gracefully than the 1953 Buick Wildcat 1, the turquoise roadster that briefly dazzled the world before fading into its own kind of legend.
Back in 1954, when America's car culture was bursting with optimism, and every showroom felt like a peek into tomorrow, Plymouth unveiled something nobody expected from a company known mainly for sensible family cars. They called it the Plymouth Belmont. And even today, older car folks remember it the way you remember a beautiful stranger you met once, admired deeply, and never saw again. It was that kind of car. Brief, breathtaking, and unforgettable. To understand why the Belmont stood out, you have to picture what the early 50s were like. Chevrolet had just shocked the world with the Corvette, a fiberglass two-seater that looked like pure Hollywood. Ford was quietly preparing the Thunderbird. America wanted speed and style, but Chrysler, and especially Plymouth, wasn't known for taking such bold steps. That's why the Belmont hit people like a surprise note in a familiar song. Under the bright Motorama-style lights, it didn't look like anything the company had ever built. The first thing that drew your eye was its shape. Fiberglass gave designers a freedom they had never had with steel, and Plymouth's styling team used that freedom like sculptors. The Belmont's front fenders stretched forward in long, graceful sweeps, almost like arms reaching into the wind. The hood dipped down low and clean, the kind of low nose that made people whisper about aerodynamics, even if they didn't fully understand the term. The side panels were smooth and unbroken, and the rear end tapered gently into a rounded, almost European form. Simple, elegant, quiet. Older visitors at the time said the car had a kind of calm beauty, as if it were made from a single flowing breath rather than a collection of panels and seams. It was a sports car, yes, but not a loud or aggressive one. It didn't shout with fins or chrome. It didn't try to look like a rocket ship. Instead, it had the poise of a dancer, confident without trying to impress. The windshield sat low and curved just enough to frame the interior without overwhelming it. When you walked around the Belmont, you felt as if you were admiring a piece of art rather than a machine, and people at the show would often circle it twice just to take it all in. Then there was the interior, which carried the same theme of delicate simplicity. No exaggerated gauges, no cluttered dash, nothing to distract from the feeling of openness. The seats were contoured in a way that made people want to sit down, place their hands on the wheel, and imagine a quiet morning drive along the coast, the kind where the sun is just rising and the air is cool and clean. Every little detail reinforced the idea that this wasn't a Plymouth as the public knew them. It was something more refined, a glimpse of a future in which Chrysler dared to dream. And powering this dream was a small but mighty heart, the 241 cubic inch Red Ram Hemi V8.
It was a clever choice. It wasn't massive, but it had the smoothness and punch of a real performance engine. Engineers who tested the Belmont behind closed doors said it moved with surprising eagerness, pulling the lightweight fiberglass body forward with confidence. Imagine sitting low behind that wraparound windshield, hearing that V8 hum softly, and feeling the car glide forward like it wanted to stay ahead of its own shadow. For older folks who saw it run, that memory stayed with them for decades. But as beautiful and promising as the Belmont was, it arrived at a crossroads where courage was required, and the company simply didn't have enough of it. Plymouth had a reputation to protect: reliable, affordable cars for families, not fiberglass two-seaters for dreamers. Executives looked at the sales struggles of the early Corvette and shuddered. They worried that a Plymouth sports car would confuse buyers, cost too much to build, and fail before it even had a chance. They saw risk, not opportunity. And like many big companies in that era, they chose safety over imagination. So, the Plymouth Belmont, that graceful little roadster with the long fenders and the quiet confidence, remained alone. One car, one experiment, one bright spark in a showroom full of practical sedans. After the show season, it didn't go into production. It didn't get a follow-up model or a second prototype or a comeback in later years. Instead, it was tucked away, much like a beautiful painting stored in the back of a gallery where only a few lucky visitors ever get to see it again. Over the decades, car lovers kept the Belmont alive in their hearts. They passed around old photos, pulled out faded brochures, told younger enthusiasts stories about that little fiberglass Plymouth they only made one of. It became a symbol, a reminder of what could have happened if Chrysler had been just a bit braver in the 1950s, just willing enough to take a chance on beauty. Today, the 1954 Plymouth Belmont remains a single perfect moment in automotive history. A moment when Plymouth dared to dream, even if only for a short time. A moment when a quiet, elegant roadster challenged the expectations people had of an everyday American brand. And though it never got a sequel, it lives on as a legend. A lovely, lonely idea preserved forever in the memories of those who saw it shine under the lights all those years ago.
In 1955, when Americans were dreaming about jetpacks, flying saucers, and a future filled with dazzling technology, Ford decided to build a car that looked like it had slipped right out of a child's imagination. They called it the Ford Mystere, and anyone who saw it back then still remembers the way it made your heart jump, like seeing tomorrow parked right in front of you. It wasn't just a car. It was a sketch of the future come to life. The Mystere didn't look like anything that had rolled off an assembly line. It looked like something the Jetsons might have borrowed. The most striking feature was the clear bubble canopy that covered the entire passenger compartment. Not just a curved windshield or a big window, a full dome of see-through material that wrapped over the seats like a glass helmet. You didn't open doors, you raised the bubble to go inside. Older folks who visited the Ford exhibits remember the feeling of stepping toward it and seeing their reflections curve across that strange glass. It made the car seem almost alive. Underneath that dome sat a dashboard filled with knobs, lights, experimental switches, and little futuristic displays. None of it was meant for everyday use. Ford designers simply wanted to show what a future control center might look like. It had the same feeling you get when you step inside an old science fiction movie set. There were no familiar shapes, no comforting gauges. Instead, everything looked like it had been borrowed from an early spaceship. You could almost imagine a pilot's voice saying, "Prepare for takeoff," before touching one of those glowing buttons.
The body itself carried the spirit of the times, thin, delicate fins rising from the rear, a nose that looked ready to cut through imaginary space wind, and surfaces so smooth they reflected light like polished chrome, even without much chrome attached. It had a kind of floating grace to it. Some spectators swore it didn't look like a car at all, but rather an idea sketched in steel and glass. Its name was perfect, Mystere. It carried the mystery of a future no one could quite describe, but everyone hoped would arrive soon. But the truth behind that dazzling bubble roof soon became obvious. As exciting as it looked, it turned the inside of the Mystere into a miniature greenhouse. Sunshine poured through every angle of that transparent dome. In cool weather, it was fine, warm, even cozy. But in summer, at outdoor shows, the interior heated up so fast that Ford workers joked about cooking lunch inside it. People said that sitting under the dome felt like climbing into a parked car on the hottest July day. One visitor famously quipped, "You'd need oven mitts just to hold the steering wheel," and he wasn't far off. Engineers had no way to ventilate such a space effectively at the time. There were no modern air conditioning systems capable of cooling a giant bubble of hot air. Ford could tame the shape with imagination, but not the sun. The Mystere became a beautiful idea that demonstrated its own problem. Sometimes the future looks better in drawings than it does under real daylight. That's why it remained a one-off, a concept, a single shimmering prediction of what cars might look like on the faraway road to the year 2000. Ford never intended to build a production version. It was meant to inspire, to make people gasp, to create that moment of wonder when kids tugged their parents' sleeves and asked, "Is that really a car?" It did exactly what it was meant to do. It stretched the imagination. It made people believe that the future would be bold and bright and filled with machines that could almost fly. After the auto shows, the Mystere disappeared into Ford's private archives like a prop from a forgotten sci-fi film, preserved, admired, but never replicated. Yet even now, older drivers still talk about it with a kind of fond disbelief. That strange roof, those little fins, the glowing dashboard knobs. It was a promise of a tomorrow that never quite came true. The Mystere remains a perfect time capsule of mid-century optimism, a reminder when designers dreamed with no rules, when cars weren't just transportation, but visions. And for a brief moment in 1955, Ford let the world peek inside one of those dreams, a dream so bright it practically needed sunglasses.
In 1956, when America believed the future would be all chrome, tail fins, and atomic-age miracles, General Motors decided to push imagination to its very edge. They unveiled the Oldsmobile Golden Rocket, a concept so dramatic that even people who only saw it once, decades ago, still describe it with the same excitement you hear in the voices of pilots talking about their first airplane. It wasn't simply a car. It was a fantasy, shaped in metal and shown under bright Motorama lights to a country that was ready to dream big. Picture the Golden Rocket the way those old show visitors first saw it. Low to the ground, stretched long and sleek, with a nose that came to a sharp point almost like the tip of a rocket just waiting for ignition. The body wrapped around the wheels with exaggerated curves that made it look like it could cut through the air without a whisper. The paint carried a warm golden tone, glowing like sunset on polished brass. Even standing still, it had a restless energy, as if it were impatient for someone to climb in and launch it towards some unseen horizon. The doors were the first true spectacle. Instead of opening outward like a regular car, each door lifted upward in a smooth arc, almost like a bird raising one wing. And when the doors rose, the seats rose too. They lifted automatically, turning slightly toward you as if inviting you inside. It was a gentle, graceful motion, the kind of futuristic courtesy that seemed almost magical in 1956. People gathered around and murmured in awe. Some older showgoers still remember leaning forward with both hands on the railing just to make sure their eyes weren't deceiving them. Back then, automatic anything was astonishing. Inside, the Golden Rocket looked more like the cockpit of a sleek jet than the interior of a car. The seats were low and sculpted, the steering wheel had a futuristic split design, and the instrument panel wrapped around the driver in a way nobody had seen before. Everything had a purpose, a flourish, a sense of confidence. This wasn't a car meant to blend in with traffic. It was meant to show you what driving might feel like in a world where highways were smooth, wide ribbons connecting one shining city to the next. And perhaps the most astonishing part was how natural it all felt under the bright Motorama lights. The Golden Rocket didn't feel exaggerated or silly. It felt like the next logical step. America was in love with speed, with jets, with the idea of streamlined motion. Car designers were borrowing ideas from airplane engineers, and the public loved every inch of that influence. When the Golden Rocket rotated slowly on its display platform, you could see the crowd leaning in, as if gravity had shifted a little. It pulled you toward it. Under the dramatic skin, GM placed a version of Oldsmobile's Rocket V8, a name that fit the car as perfectly as its sculpted tail fins. The engine wasn't the point. Nobody expected the Golden Rocket to break land speed records. It was built to stir imagination, and in 1956, imagination was currency. GM spent that currency generously with this car, pouring dreams into its lines, its doors, its very posture. But like many great dreams of the Motorama era, the Golden Rocket existed for one purpose: to dazzle. GM showed it proudly, let it soak up flashbulbs and admiration, and then did what companies often did with such experimental creations. They gently rolled it off stage, tucked it into quiet storage, and moved on to the next idea. Production was never seriously considered. Not because the public didn't want it, they certainly did, but because the car was too complex, too costly, too far ahead of what a normal assembly line could handle. It was a showpiece disguised as a coupe. For years afterward, people who saw it at Motorama spoke about it the way one talks about a remarkable sunset or a favorite childhood memory. The upward lifting doors, the rising seats, the rocket-like profile, these things lingered in their minds long after the real car had disappeared into storage. Even today, older enthusiasts smile when the Golden Rocket is mentioned. They remember the excitement, the flashbulbs, the low hum of the crowd pressing closer to see this strange golden creature from the future. The 1956 Oldsmobile Golden Rocket remains exactly what its name suggests, a shining projectile from an era when American car design wasn't afraid to dream loudly. It was wild, graceful, and utterly impractical, and that is precisely why it is still remembered. It never needed a sequel. The one that existed was enough to leave its mark, glowing softly in the memories of those who witnessed its brief, brilliant moment
under the show lights.
The 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser XM 800 was more than a car. It was a vision, a bold statement from a time when America's highways were just beginning to stretch across the continent, and people believed that driving could feel like flying. Mercury's designers poured their imagination into every inch of it, treating steel, glass, and chrome as though they were clay to be molded into the automobile of tomorrow. The moment the car was unveiled, even the most skeptical visitors at the auto shows stopped in their tracks. The body sat long and low, with slender roof pillars that gave the impression the glass roof was floating above the cabin, and the rear end sported taillights that seemed more like shooting stars captured in polished metal than anything functional. Its sweeping lines, the subtle curves of its fenders, and the bold presence of the front grille combined to make a car that seemed alive, like it was moving even while standing still. Inside, Mercury's designers continued the futuristic theme. The dashboard stretched wide, adorned with chrome and controls that seemed to hint at space-age technology, each knob and button deliberately placed to suggest something beyond ordinary driving. The steering wheel, large and elegant, resembled a control yoke more than a traditional wheel, and the seating was low and deeply contoured, inviting the driver to imagine gliding across wide-open highways. The V8 engine beneath the hood offered real power, and while it wasn't meant to break speed records, it promised effortless cruising, the kind of smooth, confident acceleration that would feel perfectly at home on the turnpikes of the future. Mercury intended the XM 800 to be the family car of tomorrow, a comfortable, powerful, and visually striking machine that could inspire both awe and desire. But ambition has its costs. The production of such a car was far more expensive than even Mercury anticipated. Every curved panel, every piece of delicate chrome, every unusual mechanism added weight and complexity to the design. The slender roof pillars, while visually striking, required special engineering to maintain structural integrity. The taillights and other decorative elements needed precise handwork to achieve the clean, flowing lines the designers envisioned. To produce the XM 800 on any scale would have demanded an enormous budget, far beyond what Mercury could justify, especially for a car that would have appealed only to a niche segment of buyers willing to embrace such a radically futuristic design. Even more than the cost, there was the question of public readiness. Audiences were amazed by the XM 800 at auto shows, but their reactions were mixed. Some gasped in delight at its daring, while others simply nodded, unsure whether they could imagine driving it in the real world. It was a car decades ahead of its time, and the average buyer in 1957 was still drawn to more conventional lines, more practical layouts, and familiar styling cues. While the public could admire a vision, it seemed hesitant to embrace one that challenged their understanding of what a family car should be. Mercury executives watched these reactions carefully and realized that pushing the car into production carried not just financial risk, but also the risk of confusing the brand's loyal customers. So, quietly, the project was shelved. The XM 800 never went beyond its prototype form. Unlike other experimental cars that might have received limited runs, Mercury decided that the one car they had built would be enough to represent their ambitions, a single statement to hint at the possibilities without fully committing to them.
Once the auto shows ended, the XM800 was carefully stored away, protected from the elements, its lines preserved, its vision kept intact for the eyes of future enthusiasts. It became a museum piece, a treasure of the brand, admired and studied by those who could appreciate the daring of its design, but it never saw the open roads it had been imagined to conquer. Over the years, stories of the XM800 circulated among car enthusiasts and collectors. People who had seen it in 1957 remembered the awe it inspired, the way it seemed almost alive with possibility, and the way it captured the optimism of an era when America truly believed the future would arrive in shiny, streamlined shapes. Historians of the automobile often cite the Turnpike cruiser as a symbol of what could have been, a glimpse of a family car that was powerful, elegant, and daring, a machine that could challenge conventions and expand ideas about American car design. Yet its place as a singular creation gives it a mystique that few production cars could ever match. Today, the XM800 stands as a testament to ambition and imagination, a reminder that sometimes the boldest ideas never leave the drawing board, not because they lack merit, but because the world isn't ready for them. It is a car that taught people to dream, even if they never got to drive it. Visitors to museums and private collections still stop and linger, tracing the low, sweeping roofline with their eyes, marveling at the delicate chrome, and imagining what it would have been like to glide down an endless turnpike in a car that looked like it had been built not just to move, but to inspire. It is both a relic and a prophecy. A single shining example of what American automotive design might have been if risk had been rewarded and the future embraced a little sooner. The 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser XM800 remains a car that whispers of a future that never arrived, yet continues to spark wonder, nostalgia, and admiration, more than 60 years after it first appeared.
The 1960 Cadillac Eldorado Brougham concept was not just a car, it was a statement, a vision of luxury and style that seemed to come from a world beyond the ordinary streets of America. When Cadillac unveiled it, people were stunned. It was low, long, and sleek, stretching almost impossibly from bumper to bumper, with lines so sharp and precise that it looked like it had been cut from a slab of stainless steel. Every curve and edge communicated elegance and authority. This wasn't a vehicle meant to blend into traffic. It was meant to dominate attention, to make the observer stop and imagine what driving the ultimate Cadillac might feel like. One of the first things anyone noticed was the roof. Unlike most cars of the era, which had simple painted steel tops or vinyl coverings, this concept had a stainless steel roof that gleamed like a polished mirror. It caught sunlight and reflected the world around it, giving the car an almost ethereal glow. The craftsmanship was astonishing. The metal was perfectly flat, perfectly formed, without a ripple, crease, or seam in sight. People who saw it in the showrooms remembered walking around it slowly, fingertips hovering over the fenders, almost afraid to touch what looked more like art than a machine. Then there were the doors. Cadillac chose to fit rear doors that opened backward, a design known as suicide doors, which created a sense of ceremony when entering or exiting the car. It wasn't just practical, it was theatrical. Owners could slide in as if entering a private lounge on wheels, doors framing the passengers like the wings of a stage set. Even the interior was extraordinary. Soft leather, intricate trim, and instruments arranged with a sense of precision made every glance feel purposeful. It was a cockpit of luxury, crafted to impress not just the driver, but anyone who sat inside. Cadillac was saying, with every inch of this car, that luxury was not a mere option, it was a lifestyle. The Eldorado Brougham concept also carried power beneath its long hood, with Cadillac's signature V8 engineered to deliver effortless motion. But unlike most performance-focused machines of the era, the emphasis was not on speed or thrills. The car was built for comfort, for grandeur, for a statement of refinement. Every aspect of the design, from the suspension to the steering, reflected Cadillac's intention to create the pinnacle of American automotive luxury. It was the kind of car that made other cars in the showroom look ordinary, even humble by comparison. But the very ambition that made the Eldorado Brougham so remarkable also made it impossible to produce. Each panel, each detail, each unique feature required hours of careful handwork, a level of precision that could not be replicated on a production line without immense expense. Cadillac executives quickly realized that even if they built a small series, the costs would be astronomical, the logistics impossible, and the potential buyers far too few. The concept could inspire, it could turn heads, it could define the future of the brand in theory, but in practice it would be financially reckless. And so, after a brief period of public display and admiration, the single Eldorado Brougham concept was quietly retired from the spotlight. It was preserved as a symbol, an example of what Cadillac could achieve when imagination and resources met without restraint. It never became a showroom model. It never ferried wealthy owners down boulevard after boulevard. Its life was brief, but its impact was lasting. Designers and enthusiasts remembered it as a car that dared to challenge the ordinary, that turned heads not with speed, but with elegance and audacity. Even decades later, the 1960 Eldorado Brougham concept is remembered not as a production failure, but as a masterpiece of automotive artistry. It represents a moment in time when American luxury was at its most daring, when a car could be as much a statement of taste and imagination as it was a mode of transportation. Its stainless steel roof, its backward-opening doors, and its commanding presence all continue to captivate collectors and historians, reminding us that some cars are never meant to be common, only extraordinary. It is a single, shining example of what happens when designers are given free rein to dream, and a car that continues to symbolize the ultimate in style and elegance, even though it never carried a single passenger down a public street.
The 1963 Chevrolet Corvair Monza GT was one of those rare moments in American automotive history when imagination seemed to leap ahead of reality, producing a car so daring that it almost didn't feel like it belonged to its own time. At a glance, it was tiny and wedge-shaped, with lines so sharp, precise, and intentional that it could have been mistaken for a small Italian roadster parked among Ferraris and Lancias. The body sat low, almost kissing the ground, with a front end that sloped aggressively and a canopy-style roof that wrapped the driver in a bubble of glass and metal. The rear deck tapered sharply, giving the car the unmistakable stance of something built not merely to drive, but to cut through the air with the precision of a jet fighter. Showgoers often recalled the effect it had on the imagination. It looked as though it could leap off the showroom floor and streak down the highway at impossible speed, even when stationary. Children pressed their faces to the glass in awe, while older men leaned close, tracing the contours with their eyes and whispering that it looked impossibly European, yet undeniably American. Chevrolet intended the Monza GT as a concept that would push the public's perception of what an American sports car could be. It was based loosely on the Corvair platform, yet the designers had transformed it into a vision that felt years ahead of its time. The canopy roof gave a sense of cockpit-like intimacy, as though the driver were a pilot commanding a tiny fighter jet rather than a family sedan. The car's profile was purposeful, elegant, and dynamic, with thin pillars and expansive glass that maximized visibility and created the illusion of being suspended in space. Even the smallest details, from the sculpted fenders to the minimalist rear lights, were designed with the same philosophy. Every line, every angle, every curve needed to evoke speed, sophistication, and futuristic style. People visiting the Motorama and other auto shows where it was displayed were enchanted. Whispers of admiration ran through the crowds. Some joked that Chevrolet had smuggled a Ferrari into Detroit and painted it green. Others argued that it was something even more daring, a vision of the future that no European car could match. But behind the beauty and innovation, the Monza GT carried a shadow of concern. By 1963, the Corvair name itself had begun to attract attention for all the wrong reasons. Rumors and early critiques about handling quirks and safety concerns were beginning to emerge, casting a cloud over Chevrolet's otherwise ambitious project. The Monza GT, though not related mechanically in any direct way, could not escape this association. Executives worried that bringing such a daring, high-profile concept to production would invite scrutiny, headlines, and potential liability. The design team pushed for it, pointing out that the car could become a halo vehicle for Chevrolet, a way to inspire excitement and sales across the entire brand. But management, cautious and conservative, decided the risk was too great. The public was not ready for such a radically styled, futuristic American sports car, and so the Monza GT was quietly shelved. After its brief moment in the spotlight at auto shows, the car was placed into storage, where it remained a silent reminder of what could have been. It never received a production order, never rolled off an assembly line, never thrilled buyers on open highways. Yet, its legacy was far from forgotten. Designers who saw it spoke of its influence for years, using its sleek wedge shape, low stance, and canopy roof as inspiration for later sports cars and show vehicles. Car historians reference it as a pivotal moment when American automakers dared to experiment boldly with European-style aesthetics, aerodynamics, and futuristic touches, even if commercial realities prevented follow-through. Collectors and enthusiasts remember the Monza GT not only as a beautifully executed concept, but as a symbol of lost opportunity. It was a car that could have reshaped public perceptions of American design, showing that Detroit could produce vehicles as visually daring, technically precise, and emotionally captivating as anything coming from Italy or Germany. And while only one was ever built, that single car left a lasting impression on everyone who saw it. The wedge-shaped body, the low canopy, the precise details, and the almost audacious stance created a car that could inspire decades of imagination long after the polished floors of the auto show had been vacated. Today, the 1963 Chevrolet Corvair Monza GT remains a lonely masterpiece, a single shining example of what happens when ambition, vision, and artistry collide in the American automotive industry. It reminds us that some of the most remarkable cars are never meant for production, existing only to stir hearts, ignite imaginations, and whisper of futures that almost were. Even 60 years later, it continues to capture attention, drawing people close to marvel at the daring wedge, the cockpit-like interior, and the quiet confidence of a tiny car that seemed to defy convention entirely.
The 1966 Ford X100 was not just a car, it was an audacious leap into the future. A machine that existed purely to explore what automobiles could become when engineers and designers were allowed to think beyond style, performance, and comfort. While most cars of the mid-1960s were racing to catch the eye with chrome, tail fins, and muscle, the X100 moved in the opposite direction. It was a quiet, purposeful experiment, a rolling laboratory devoted entirely to safety, foresight, and innovation. Those who first encountered it at Ford's test tracks remembered it not for its looks, which were unusual but not glamorous, but for the sense that they were seeing the future take shape right before their eyes. It was long, low, and purposeful, with a body designed not for mass production, but to allow engineers access to every critical system, every sensor, and every mechanism that could be tested, adjusted, or improved. Inside, the X100 was a marvel of experimental engineering. Its interior looked nothing like a conventional car. Prototype seatbelts, far ahead of their time, wrapped around the seats with careful precision, designed to restrain occupants in ways that would not be seen on American roads for many years. Crash cushions lined areas of the interior and even the exterior, absorbing energy from impacts in ways that were revolutionary for the era. Engineers had begun to study how a car's structure could be designed to protect passengers in collisions long before crumple zones became standard, and the X100 was their proving ground. Every panel, every joint, every bolt had a purpose. Nothing was decorative, everything was functional, a tangible statement of research and safety innovation. Perhaps the most futuristic and eye-catching feature was the car's primitive camera and sensor systems. In a time when rear-view mirrors were standard but rudimentary, the X100 carried small cameras inside and outside, allowing engineers to study visibility, driver behavior, and simulated collision scenarios. Sensors embedded throughout the chassis and suspension recorded data on stress, impact, and acceleration during tests. Every run of the X100, every twist of the wheel, every simulated emergency gave engineers information that could save lives decades later. Even simple maneuvers were meticulously documented, with the single car acting as a mobile laboratory that could replicate conditions no ordinary vehicle could withstand without destruction. Ford used the X100 to experiment with early versions of technologies we now take for granted. Retractable seatbelts, energy-absorbing crash surfaces, enhanced steering responsiveness, and basic surveillance of the driver's environment. Engineers pushed the car to extremes, intentionally testing the boundaries of what a human occupant could survive.
The vehicle's design was not meant to be pretty, it was meant to be informative, a carefully crafted tool that combined mechanics, electronics, and human factors in ways that were far ahead of its time. Unlike show cars meant to dazzle with chrome and polish, the X100 had the quiet authority of serious work. It was a vehicle that said, "We are studying, observing, learning," rather than "look at me." Only one X100 was ever built, and that was deliberate. Ford did not need multiple units. The car was unique because it was sufficient to provide all the data engineers required. After years of testing, recording, experimenting, and refining, the X100 was retired. It never carried a family down a public street, never appeared in a showroom, and never competed for headlines. Yet its influence quietly radiated through the automotive industry. Ideas first tried and tested in that singular machine, the use of seatbelts as standard safety equipment, shock-absorbing panels, better structural engineering, and attention to driver visibility slowly became integral to cars across the country. Every safety feature that drivers eventually came to accept as normal owed something to the lessons learned from this one experimental vehicle. Those who had the privilege of witnessing the X100 in action remember it with a mixture of awe and nostalgia. Engineers recall the hum of its instruments, the sight of carefully mounted sensors, and the almost clinical precision with which tests were conducted. Observers noted its purposeful, almost serious demeanor. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't designed to attract crowds, but it carried a sense of importance that could be felt the moment it moved. Children who glimpsed it at Ford's test facilities would later recall it as a futuristic car that felt alive, while older engineers considered it a silent sentinel, watching over the future of automotive safety and quietly guiding the decisions that would protect millions of people for generations. The 1966 Ford X100 remains a singular, lonely masterpiece in the history of the automobile. It is an icon of foresight and courage, a reminder that innovation is not always glamorous, that progress sometimes happens quietly, and that the most important vehicles may never leave a factory floor for the open road. Though it never transported a single passenger in ordinary traffic, it shaped the very way cars would be built, tested, and experienced for decades to come. It is a testament to imagination paired with meticulous engineering, an enduring symbol that sometimes the most extraordinary cars are those that exist solely to teach, to experiment, and to whisper the secrets of the future to those willing to listen.
The 1969 Dodge Charger 3 was more than just a concept car. It was a vision, a bold declaration of what American automotive design could aspire to when it dared to break free from convention. Unlike the stock Chargers cruising through streets in the late 1960s, the Charger 3 looked as if it had been teleported from the future. Its sleek, low-slung fastback shape was unlike anything else on the road. A long, pointed nose, a sharply tapering rear, and a body that flowed in one continuous line from front to back, giving it the appearance of gliding instead of rolling. The canopy-style roof, which flipped forward to allow entry, made getting inside feel like climbing into a fighter jet rather than a conventional automobile. People who saw it at auto shows often described a sense of awe, a feeling that they were witnessing a vehicle that belonged to a different era entirely. A machine born not of the present, but of imagination and ambition. Every detail of the Charger 3 was carefully considered to create an impression of speed, power, and advanced engineering.
The headlights were hidden, the glass canopy curved in a way that emphasized aerodynamics, and the interior was designed with the driver at the center, controls angled precisely toward the cockpit for a sense of command. The seats hugged the occupants, reinforcing the illusion that they were sitting in a machine capable of cutting through air at supersonic speeds. Dodge envisioned this car as a way to capture the attention of younger buyers, to signal that the brand could innovate boldly, and to show that American automakers were capable of blending performance, style, and futuristic flair into a single cohesive package. Yet the very qualities that made the Charger 3 so thrilling also sealed its fate. The canopy roof, while visually stunning, was mechanically complex and required precise engineering that would have been difficult to produce at scale. The body panels were crafted with angles and curves that would have demanded painstaking handwork for every car built, making it prohibitively expensive to mass produce. The flush-mounted lights, aerodynamic contours, and futuristic interior were unlike anything the average buyer would have seen or perhaps even wanted at the time. While the public adored its show presence, Dodge executives knew that translating this prototype into a production model would have been a logistical and financial nightmare. The car was simply too radical, too far ahead of its time to exist beyond its singular, gleaming prototype. After a brief stint at auto shows and promotional events, the Charger 3 was quietly retired and stored, becoming a private legend within Dodge. Unlike production models, it never carried a family down a highway or performed in daily traffic. Instead, it served as a benchmark, an exercise in ambition, and a tangible reminder that creativity need not be limited by practicality. Engineers, designers, and enthusiasts alike looked at the Charger 3 and saw a standard of daring that few cars could match. Its influence, while indirect, shaped subsequent Dodge designs, inspiring sleeker fastbacks, more daring interiors, and a willingness to experiment with automotive form that carried forward into future generations. The Charger 3 was also a cultural statement. In an era dominated by muscle cars, chrome, and aggressive V8s, Dodge had created something that spoke to imagination, not raw horsepower. The car symbolized speed even at a standstill, aerodynamics without compromise, and the promise of adventure beyond the mundane. Children who glimpsed it at auto shows remembered it as a spaceship they could almost climb into, while adults appreciated the precision and craftsmanship that went into every line, panel, and feature. It was a concept that bridged dreams and reality, showing that cars could inspire emotion just as much as they could carry passengers. Today, the 1969 Dodge Charger 3 remains one of the most remarkable concept cars of the late 1960s, remembered not for production numbers, sales, or everyday usability, but for its audacious vision. Photographs and preserved examples continue to captivate enthusiasts, conveying the same sense of wonder they must have provoked at their first unveiling. Its forward-tilting canopy, dramatic wedge shape, and jet-like presence remind us that some of the most important vehicles are never meant to be common, only extraordinary. The Charger 3's story is a lesson in ambition, creativity, and the delicate balance between imagination and practicality. It was a car that existed to inspire, to push boundaries, and to challenge the public's expectations of what an American car could be.
Though only one was ever made, its legacy is far greater than that number suggests. It is a symbol of a time when designers dared to dream wildly, when an automaker could imagine a machine that looked like a spaceship, and when the possibilities of the future seemed just within reach. The 1969 Dodge Charger 3 remains a lonely, singular masterpiece, a car that whispers across the decades with elegance, audacity, and the irresistible thrill of what might have been. A true icon of American automotive imagination, frozen forever in steel, glass, and daring.